to what is the last Annenberg Research Seminar for the fall semester. It's hard to believe that it's gone this quickly, but we have another great semester lined up next semester as well. We're looking forward to that as well. We're delighted to have James Fowler with us here today. James is an associate professor at the University of California at San Diego. He did his BA, his MA, and his PhD at Harvard University. And he threw in an MA for an extra MA for good luck from Yale. And he's been a very productive scholar and writer ever since he finished his degree. I'll read you the name of a couple of the articles because these are very directly relevant to those of you who are interested in communication networks. The legislative success in a small world, social network analysis and the dynamics of congressional legislation, coming out in the next issue of Journal of Politics. Another one, Alone in the Crowd, the structure and spread of loneliness in a large social network. That's in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Another one, Model of Genetic Variation in Human Social Networks, which is in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences for 2009. Another one, David, there's a place over there. Come sit. There are two places actually if you want. Great. And there may need to be one back. Dynamic Spread of Happiness in a Large Social Network, which is in the British Medical Journal. And then one more, The Collective Dynamics of Smoking in a Large Social Network, which is published in the New England Journal of Medicine. A wide variety of very interesting topics that are published in a wide variety of areas. In case you have not seen it, this is his latest book. It's entitled Connected: The Surprising Power of Our Social Networks and How They Shape Our Lives. You see he's got the same fish on the cover here as he's got up there. This book has gotten some terrific reviews, most recently in the New York Times, and it's been selected as one of the Times top books of the year. So I have read it, and I can personally recommend it to you. I think it does a great job of taking a lot of the technical and sophisticated research on networks and translating it into very accessible and interesting language and style. So I recommend it to you highly. I'm pleased to say that this is an Annenberg Network sponsored session today. And we're delighted that James can be with us today and this afternoon, spending the time with our research group later on today. So without further ado, James, welcome to the Annenberg School. We're delighted to have you. Thank you very much.
So what a great group of people. It looks like there are a lot of networks in the room. So this will be a good topic for you guys. I'm sure that a lot of this will be stuff that's very intuitive. So how many political scientists are in the room? Okay, we got a few guys there at the back. It's funny, a lot of times I'll give talks. I'm talking about the spread of obesity. I'm talking about the spread of happiness or loneliness. Or I'm talking about a paper that we had published in Physica A on different modularity constructs. And so I often find myself talking to audiences of people that don't have political scientists in them. And they ask me, how on earth, as a political scientist, did you come to do this kind of work? And so I always like to tell them the story about how Nicholas Christakis, my co-author, were connected and I met. Because that is a social network story. In graduate school, I was very interested in this question that really plagues political scientists. And I say plague because we keep thinking about it and keep getting it wrong. And that is, why do people vote? And so if you think about a modern election like in the United States, like the election we had in the year 2000, even the closest election we've ever had was still separated by 700 people. And so 700 people in Florida, you can imagine, they're probably thinking, if they had only changed their minds about who to vote for, then things somehow might have been different. But if you actually think through this process of what would have happened if they had changed their vote or decided not to vote, any of those 700 people that separated the two presidential candidates in the year 2000, what would have changed? Nothing would have changed. Absolutely nothing would have changed. And so if you think about the way people make decisions, and you think that people are making rational choices, as economists would say, then you have to ask yourself, well, am I going to do A or am I going to do B? And what am I going to get if A happens, and what am I going to get if B happens? Well, if you vote, you get A. If you don't vote, you get A. And so why bother? What's the point of all this? And so we've had a lot of game theorists come along and analyze this problem and realize that it's very difficult. It's kind of a paradox. Because with millions of people out there, it would be really very easy for us to decide that it actually makes no difference for any one of us to show up. And as I was pondering this problem one evening, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, I was drifting to sleep, I remembered this shampoo commercial from the 1970s. It was this shampoo commercial where the woman gets so enthralled with her shampoo that she tells 2 friends, and then they tell 2 friends, and so on, and so on, and so on. And the screen splits every time, and suddenly there's 64 women who are all using this shampoo. And it occurred to me that maybe we're getting this wrong. Maybe it's a good thing for us to understand deductively individual decision-making by focusing on one person. But this Robinson Crusoe model of social science has its limits, in the sense that it causes us to think about how we affect ourselves and not how we affect other people. And maybe it's possible that one person's decision to vote or to get involved in politics doesn't just influence their outcomes, but influence the outcomes of their friends, and of their friends, and of their friends. And if it's a case that each of us is tied to 10 or 20 people, and each of them is tied to 10 or 20 people, and each of them is tied to 10 or 20 people, then suddenly one person's actions potentially could ripple out to thousands. And so I told my advisor about the shampoo commercial, and he scratched his head, and he wasn't quite sure what to do with me. But the very next day, after I told him this, he went to see a talk by Nicholas Christakis, who was very interested in another question that had to do with bringing the social world into the question about human behavior. He had studied a thing called the widower effect, in which we know now, through countless studies, that when one member of a spousal couple dies, it increases the risk of death in the other member of the spousal couple. And so just for example, if the woman dies in a spousal couple, the man loses about 7 years of his life. When the man dies, the woman loses about 2 years of her life. I'll let you speculate on the reasons for the differences between them. But this is very well established. It's one of the oldest questions in medical sociology. Actually started in the 18th century. When they first started keeping records, this was one of the questions that they looked at, one of the very first questions they looked at. And Nicholas was very interested in this idea that maybe it's not just the case that this huge effect on mortality spreads from one person to another, perhaps it spreads even beyond. So that when your spouse dies, it affects not just you, but your friends, maybe your neighbors, maybe your coworkers, and maybe their friends, and maybe their spouses. And so when my advisor went to hear Nicholas give this talk, he said, wait a minute, I've heard this before. Where have I heard this before? Oh yeah, my crazy graduate student was talking about the same thing just the day before. And he got really excited and he came in and he said, you two have to meet. You're talking about the same thing. You're talking about human behavior. He's talking about health. You're talking about politics. But what you're talking about ultimately is the way behavior can spread in these vast, beautiful human social networks from person to person to person. And so this is how Nicholas and I got started working together. And the very first thing that we realized that we needed when we got together was we needed data. Because we have lots of really good information, lots of good studies out there about how one person affects another person. But to me, this is sort of like a bunch of researchers who are interested in knowing what happens to a set of dominoes who are all set up end on end on end, coming in and tipping over the first domino, noting that the second domino has fallen, and then walking away. What we wanted to know is what happens to the rest of the dominoes. And how do we get these patterns branching through these networks? And how do we develop methods to be able to get information out of these large data sources? And so we figured out that what we needed in order to be able to achieve his goals and to achieve my goals is we needed to bring in about 5,000 people or so, given the size of the effects that we knew about that existed. We needed to bring them in over time, as I'll talk to you in the rest of the lecture. It's important to have over time information, not just about the qualities a person has and their behavior, but also about how their networks change over time. So we need to keep them coming back year after year. And we would probably need to have them seen by doctors so we get really good quality information about their health, and give them lots of surveys from sociology, from political science, and from psychology. And on the back of an envelope, we figured out that we only needed about $25 million to do this study. And so we went to NIH, and we said, can we please have $25 million? And after they got finished laughing, they said, why don't you try a pilot study instead? And so we said, okay, that's fine, that's fair. And so we started looking out in the world for a potential partner for this pilot study. And what we discovered was that just down the road from Harvard was this epidemiological study called the Framingham Heart Study. It had been around for a very long time. They started impaneling people in 1948, started impaneling their children in 1971, and then their grandchildren most recently, they started following them as well. About 5,000 people in each one of those cohorts. And they come into the doctor's office, they get examined, so we know a lot about their health. This is the study where we learn most of what we know about the relationship between smoking and cardiac disease, for example. And all we would need to do is at the next exam, the next time they had all these people come in, is start asking them questions about who are your family members, who are your friends, where do you work so we know who your coworkers are, and who are your neighbors. And in the process of talking to these guys, we discovered an amazing thing. In the cohort that started in 1971, out of 5,000 people that they followed for 32 years, they've lost 10 to follow-up. So the other almost 5,000 people keep coming in year after year after year to exams. And for any of you who have done longitudinal studies, you'll know this is a really hard thing to do, to keep people coming back. It's hard enough to get them to do it the first time. And we said, how on earth did you do this? You know, how could you possibly have managed to succeed at being able to get this kind of data and keep it for such a long period of time? And an administrator of the study said, oh, well, that's easy. She pulled up this thing called the green sheet. And on the green sheet, which was this contact sheet that they used to stay in touch with people over the course of years, people had listed not just where they lived, not just who their family members were. They also listed where they had been working, and they were asked to name a close friend. And they've been doing this at every exam since 1972. And so they had been keeping our social network data, the stuff that we had needed $25 million to build, they had been keeping that data for the last 32 years. And you know, I still get goosebumps telling the story. This is like the bread mold falling in our petri dish. We suddenly discovered that this really rich data source that was going to allow us to get a bird's eye view of the whole network had been collected for such a long period of time that all we needed to do now is just turn these paper records into electronic data. And so that was the birth of the collaboration between Nicholas and I. And today I'll talk a little bit about some of these studies that have come out of the Framingham Heart Study and try to put it in the context of a lot of other studies that people have done that really tell us how truly extraordinary and powerful our social networks really are. But before I do that, I have to start by just saying that we live in a time now where everybody knows the phrase social networks. That wasn't true 30 years ago when sociologists were busy inventing the field of social networks. And so why do people know the term social networks now? It's because of Facebook. It's because of our online world. And so when I tell people, casually on the airplane, what do you do? When I tell them about this book and I say it's on social networks, they say, oh, you mean Facebook? You mean MySpace? Oh, you mean Twitter? And we say, well, yes, we talk about those things in the book, but that's not really what the book is about. The book is about the networks that we've had for the past hundreds of thousands of years. We've always had friends. We've always had family members. And the way we interact with these people is going to have a fundamental impact, we think, on the way we interact with one another in these new online worlds. And so in order to understand, to truly understand what's going on in these new social networks, this social networking that's going on online, we really have to understand natural human social networks first to be able to figure out what the differences are and what the similarities are. And so to do that, let's first of all think about what is a social network. A social network is simply just a choice between two people about whether or not to have some kind of interaction or relationship. Okay, so the simplest network is just going to be two people who have a relationship. Now, if it were just that simple, then it would be really easy to do the analysis, right? So we would have two people, they form a connection, and maybe there's some regular way that everybody has three friends and they're connected to each other just like in a regular lattice, like a salt crystal or something like that. That's not actually the way we form friendship, though, because it's not coordinated. And in fact, the networks that we have are these agglomerated decisions by individuals to form these relationships that often bear no resemblance to the behavior of other people in their environment. But even though that's the case, these networks, they tend to have these similar structures from one human context to another. Just for example, one very crucial point of human social networks that makes us different from, say, technological networks is that we tend to have very highly transitive relationships. And the idea of transitivity is that the probability that two of your friends are friends with one another is very high. And it's like Virginia Woolf said, we may live in plazas, but we love in triangles. And it's this idea that we often will meet people through friends of friends. And as a consequence, we have very dense interconnections that we wouldn't expect if everyone was just forming friendships with people at random. And so this is just one of the ways that human social networks are very similar from one context to another, so that this complexity actually ends up being the result of some simple processes that we're starting to understand in a better way. And so we try to use this information to answer important questions like, how on earth am I going to find Mr. Right? All right, so suppose that you're a pessimist, okay, and you think that there's only one person out there in the world for you. I can't do anything for you, so sorry. If you, on the other hand, think that, well, okay, I'm not going to be so pessimistic. Let's say that there are 1 million people out there that could be suitable for me. They're somewhere, and I just have to find one of them. Well, 1 million people sounds like a lot, right? But there are 6 billion people in the world. And so if you are going to just randomly start dating people one after another, how many dates is that going to be before you're going to find Mr. Right? It's going to be about 6,000 dates. That's a lot of people. Now, we obviously don't search that way. We search for partners via the people that we already have connections to. And so this is actually very important, this mutual introductions. The same way that Nicholas and I met via my advisor is the way people frequently meet their future spouses. In fact, according to the Chicago Sex Survey, about 2 out of 3 of the spousal couples in the United States met via a friend or a family member. They were set up. It's a classic blind date, right? And so what this really illustrates is that we are able to use our networks not just to spread things, not just to spread our behavior or to learn about what other people are doing, but we use them to reshape our networks all the time. So we shape our networks, but our networks also, the structure of them, has an impact on who we'll meet in the future. And this is one of the reasons why we have these highly transitive relationships, because we often meet via friends of friends that people are going to be important to us in the future. Now, we wanted to not just look at the structure of these networks, but we wanted to be able to use this new information that we got from the Framingham Heart Study to be able to study the spread of things in these social networks. And so the very first thing that we did is we looked to see what we could say about a health outcome that was of great importance to everyone in the United States and was also something that was objectively measured in the study. And so the very first thing you do when you go to Framingham, just like the very first thing you do when you go to any doctor's visit, is you get on the scale and they measure your height. And so the best data, the best quality data that we have in the Framingham Heart Study is information about your body mass index, which is just your weight divided by your height squared. And we were very interested in this question, well, is it the case that this obesity epidemic in the United States is more than just something that's increased a lot over time? Is it something that actually spreads from person to person to person via a contagious process, the same way that you would expect, say, the flu to spread from person to person? And so the very first thing we did with this great data that we got out of Framingham was we started to draw some maps. And these maps, what we do is we color each of the nodes according to their outcome, the outcome of interest that we're interested in. Here, the yellow nodes are obese people. The green nodes are normal weight people. And we actually made the nodes proportional to body mass index. So bigger nodes are literally bigger people. So that we could start to see what kind of relationship there is between people who are connected. We also are able to use information about the relationships to know something about what kind of connections people have. And so orange relations here, for example, are genetic relationships. These are family relationships. Purple ones are non-genetic, so these are going to be friendship and spousal relationships. And then we use these algorithms to try to draw the network in a way where we're putting the people who are more closely connected via shared friendships closer together on the graph. The very first thing that you notice in a picture like this is that there are clusters of normal weight people, for example, this cluster here, and there are clusters of obese people, for example, this cluster here. Now, that's proof that there's contagion, right? No. Okay? There are lots of different things that could be driving this kind of clustering. And so just having a map like this is not sufficient. It's a necessary condition. You ought to see this kind of clustering if there's some kind of contagious process going on. But there's lots of different things that could be causing this kind of clustering. And so one possibility is it's just a false positive. Right? Every once in a while, when you flip 10 coins, you're going to get lucky and get 10 heads. Right? And so one of the things that we're going to want to do is try to figure out, how do we know that these clusters aren't just due to chance? How do we know this isn't just the Rorschach plot that the psychologist is showing us and asking us, what do you see? What patterns do you see? And so this is something that we need to address in our research. Another possibility is that people are choosing to be friends with one another based on the attribute, based on the behavior that we observe. And so in this case, for example, normal weight people might prefer to be friends with normal weight people. And that could drive the kind of clustering that we see if that were the case. And so we call this, in sociology, homophily. It's a word that literally means love of like. That's this idea that you form friendships with people who are like you. Birds of a feather flock together. And so one of the things that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to figure out some way to tease apart how much of this clustering is due to this process and how much is due to influence, this contagion process that we're interested in. But we're not just done there. There's yet a third reason why we might find clusters, and that is contextual effects. Okay, so you and your friend, you spend time together, maybe you influence each other on some processes, but maybe you guys are you have a weakness for Big Macs, and McDonald's opens up down the street. And you don't go and eat there together, you don't even talk to each other about the McDonald's, but just independently you both end up going to the McDonald's once it opens up. And so you can have shocks like this, you can have events like this in your environment happen that will cause you and your friend's weight gain to increase at the same time. You're both connected, you're both getting larger at the same time, but there's no causal process where one of you is influencing the other to gain weight. So we want to try to figure out, is there some way that we can use the data from the Framingham Heart Study, from these other studies, to be able to tease apart these three effects and see if what's left over is an influence effect that spreads from one person to another. And so the way that we get around the random issue, the false random issues, is that we can just compare the network that we have, a network like this one, to a bunch of networks where we just randomly assign who's obese and who's not. Right? And we can see how big are the clusters in that network and compare it to how big are the clusters we find in the observed network. And there it's very easy to see that the clustering is not just something due to chance. If it is, it's extraordinarily unlikely that we would actually observe this in the world. So that's an easy one to deal with. A harder one to deal with is this problem of homophily. And there what you need is you need information about how the network changes over time. And so this is a movie, actually, of how our network changes over the course of 32 years. People form friendships and get married. And that happens in a line forms between two of the circles. Sometimes the line disappears as people get divorced. Sometimes circles disappears as people pass away due to disease. And one thing that's very clear over the course of the 32 years is that the nodes are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Just like in the United States, in Framingham, over this time period, we went from an incidence of obesity of about 10% to an incidence of obesity of about 30%. And so one thing that's very clear is that we have a very large group that has gotten larger over this time period. But what we want to be able to do is use information from the network about who forms friends with who in the previous period to be able to say something about how much of this clustering is due to other things besides that friendship formation process. And so that way we think we're pretty confident about separating homophily. So how do we deal with contextual effects? Well, one way that we deal with contextual effects is we're able to look and see who nominated whom as a friend. Okay, and so for example, I may name Nicholas as a friend, and he may not name me back. You're supposed to say "aw" at this point. Right? Right, exactly. So now that's bad news for me as a person, but it's good news for me as a researcher. Because what this means now is I can see whether or not I'm having an influence on him or he's having an influence on me. If it's just McDonald's opening up down the street, we should have an equal influence on one another. But if it's a case that I nominate him as a friend and he doesn't name me back, I probably think about him more in terms of influence than he thinks about me. I esteem him more, I pay attention to him more, and so therefore when he does something prior to me, I'm more likely to take it up than the other way around. And we can actually compare that to see whether or not we are getting the same kinds of effects for an ego-perceived friend, that's someone who's named as a friend, or an alter-perceived friend, and that's the person who's doing the naming. So which one of those two people is influential? And what we find is that someone you name as a friend If they have become obese over the last 2 to 4 years, it increases the likelihood that you will become obese by 57%. For mutually named friends, where we see the strongest evidence of strongest relationships between people, it actually triples the risk of your obesity if your friend becomes obese. On the other hand, if you're the namer and you didn't get named back, in other words, the other person might not even be aware of your existence, we don't find any significant effect with one person on the other. And so it's this directionality that helps us to have added confidence that out of this observational data, we can say something a little stronger than usual about whether or not there's a causal relationship here. There's no substitute for a randomized controlled experiment. But here I think we're able to say that this isn't just about large people being friends with each other or skinny people being friends with each other. This isn't just about McDonald's opening up down the street. This in part has something to do with influence. One person's behavior influencing another person's behavior that's causing these outcomes to be in consonance with one another. Now, one other way that we think about whether or not you have these contextual effects in networks is we look to see, well, what happens in the neighborhood context. Right, so if it's really the case that McDonald's opening up and down the street is going to have an influence on both of our weight and cause it to go up and down together, then what would you expect to be the relationship between your neighbor's weight and your weight? You'd expect it to be significant, right? And in fact, because we have this great information in the Framingham Heart Study about where everyone lives, we can look and see what happens between immediate neighbors, and there's no influence, right? And so what this overall suggests is that you have to have a deep, close social contact with somebody in order for your weight status to be associated with their weight status. And that suggests that what's flowing between people here is not just some casual identification of someone who's eating more or who's a little bit larger. We're really sharing stories with other people. In fact, one interesting thing in the Framingham Heart Study is that we were able to look and see what happens to people when they move away. And your friends who live hundreds of miles away have just as big an impact on you as your friends who live next door. And so we really think that this is about the spread of norms more than about the shared behavior that you might expect. Going out to eat together, going out to drink together, going to a bar together. If your friend hundreds of miles away is having an influence on you, then this is about seeing them every once in a while and changing your ideas about appropriate behavior based on those infrequent encounters. Now we've since moved beyond health behavior to look at other kinds of outcomes, and so we have another chapter in the book about these emotional stampedes. And so here we have a map from Framingham again of who's happy and who's unhappy. The happy people are colored yellow, and the unhappy people are colored blue, of course. And you can see again you have these clusters of behavior in the network, of outcomes, where you have clusters of happy people and clusters of unhappy people. Again, what we find is when we decompose these effects and include these controls for homophily, these controls for contextual effects, we find that at least some of this clustering can be due to this influence effect where one person's becoming happy and it's increasing the likelihood that other people will become happy in the future. And so the way we think about this is imagine a herd of buffalo that's stampeding along. It wouldn't make any sense to tap a buffalo in the center of the herd and ask them, why are you stampeding? Well, the answer, I'm stampeding because everyone else is stampeding, right? And so although there are individual things that happen to us that clearly influence our happiness levels, we get married, we get divorced, we have children, there are lots of things that happen in our lives that influence our personal happiness, it is not merely a function of the things that happen just to us. It's also a function of things that happen to other people. Now, we also talk in the book about how things can spread through the economy via social networks. And so, for example, there's this great story about Northern Rock. There was a run on the bank in Northern Rock, and reporters spent a good deal of talking to people in these lines as people were waiting to draw their money out. This is the first run on the bank in Britain in over 100 years. It happened a couple of years ago. And the interesting thing is, time and again, what these people talked about is not that they thought the bank would fail, but they had friends who told them that they should get their money out. And they also were afraid that other people thought the bank would fail. And so they would say, oh, I know that there's nothing's going to happen. Everything's going to be just fine. And the British finance minister comes on and says, all your deposits are guaranteed. But they still go and do it anyway because they're concerned about what other people are doing. And one of the points that we make in the book is that these networks don't just have an impact on everyday depositors. They also have an impact on people on Wall Street. Right? And so you talk to these traders, and these traders, they have very dense networks with other traders on Wall Street. And when one of them does something, the others immediately think, is this something that I should be doing as well? And so you can get these contagion effects even more strongly in these small interconnected groups of people, which can help to explain why we've had such dramatic gyrations in the economy over the last 10 years with our bubbles and the financial collapse that we've seen over the last couple of years. You can also use networks to really structure relationships in a way that we had never before imagined to make the world a better place. And so we talk about Mohammed Yunus's innovation with microfinance loans, for example. People don't appreciate it, but those microfinance loans are a social network innovation. These women in Bangladesh who have nothing but each other, they come in groups of 5. And the way the program works is that the bank will loan the first 2 some money. Once that's repaid, then they loan the next 2 some money. Once that's repaid, then the 5th person gets their money. And essentially what you're doing is you're collateralizing these social ties because you have the other 3 people in the group who are guaranteeing the loan, providing social support to whatever activities are involved with spending the money, and also applying social pressure to make sure that the money gets paid back. And the remarkable thing is that these groups of women who have absolutely nothing have a higher repayment rate than the typical middle-class business in Bangladesh. So that at first this was actually a money-making opportunity for people in the private sector, and it's become so pervasive that you even have traders now that are rolling all these microfinance loans into larger instruments that can be traded the same way mortgage-backed bonds are traded, for example. And so social networks have a big impact on our economy as well. Of course, as a political scientist, I have to say something about political behavior spreading from person to person. And so we talk a lot in the book about the Obama campaign, and there's no doubt that social media had influence here, but we think that people kind of get the story wrong. I think people think that now we have all these new ways to reach people, that Obama was able to directly speak in the ears of millions of people in a way that he couldn't before, or directly get everyone to see his speech on race when everyone was challenging his relationship with his pastor, who got very unpopular during the campaign. And in fact, if you go and you talk to people about why they participate and what motivated them to do something differently than they had done in all their previous elections, it wasn't about Obama's direct connection to them. It was about the Obama campaign's ability to bring people together. And so you would have them, for example, very focused on getting people to have coffee with one another, and not so focused on what would come out of those meetings, but just getting them to reignite their relationships with one another. The iPhone application that they sent out for people's phones, it didn't just tell you to randomly call someone in Ohio. It told you to call your friend in Ohio. And it ordered your friends by who was in the swing state to make sure that the friends that you reconnected first were the ones where you get the biggest bang for your buck. And so it's really about this effort by politicians to connect people to each other that we think that we see a lot of what we've seen over the last 4 to 6 years or so in terms of the effect of social media on these campaigns. And this is a line where people are waiting to vote in San Diego, and by the way, that's my social network right there. And so in our book, one of the things that we know is that throughout all of these different things that we have studied and that other people have studied, we tend to find this property that we call the 3 degrees rule of influence. And so for obesity, smoking, drinking, these are health behaviors where we find these clusters extend out to 3 degrees. So what I mean by that is that if I don't know anything else about you, but I know that your friend's friend's friend is obese, then I can do better than chance at predicting whether or not you'll be obese. This is also true for smoking behavior, for drinking behavior. We also have papers on emotional states. So happiness, loneliness, and depression, they all spread exactly 3 degrees of separation and no further. In the laboratory, we started doing experiments on altruism and contributions to public goods gain. And here again, we find that experimentally, when we don't have to worry about all these issues of confounds in the observational data, experimentally, we find that if you give more money to someone else altruistically, they'll give more money to the next person, and that person will give more money to the next person. These benefits, they spread 3 degrees of separation in networks in a similar way to what we're seeing in the observational data. And then we also bring in ideas from other literature, importantly from the communications and business literature, on things like piano teacher referrals. So as it turns out, it's not hard, for example, for you to get your friend's friend's friend to send this kid to your piano lessons. But your friend's 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 friend, there's not really any evidence that they're going to do it more often than just a complete stranger in the network. And inventor ideas, we have these great patent databases which are now being put online by Google, but which have been analyzed. And as it turns out, your collaborator's collaborator's collaborator is someone you're more likely to cite than you would cite a complete stranger due to chance. But if you go out 4 degrees of separation, then you wouldn't have that same kind of distinction. It appears that these ideas between inventors are spreading 3 degrees of separation as well. And so why? Why is it 3? Well, one of the things we talk about in the book is we talk about Robin Dunbar's number. So Robin Dunbar is an anthropologist who did this nice exposition of brain size versus natural group size in primates. And what he was able to show is that when you extrapolate out to humans, this very nice neat line that goes through primates, that you would expect that human beings, based on our larger brain size, to have natural group sizes of about 150 people. And there are a lot of examples of how we live in groups of natural groups of about that size. And so consider the size of the average military unit in the United States today. It's about 110, 120 people. 2,000 years ago, when our technology was much different, how big was the size of a unit in the Roman army? It was about 100 people. We get the word centurion from the leader of 100 people. And so you have these changes in technology over time, but the natural unit that they were organized in for human groups appears to be the same. He also talks about these groups of people that lived a long time ago. They appear to live in settlements of about 150 people. He talks about the Amish people, for example, who live in North Dakota and in Canada, have this rule that once they get up above 150 people, then pretty soon what they do is they split up and form smaller sized groups. And so, you know, who knows if 150 is actually the number, right? So people have sort of talked about this as being 150 plus or minus 50. But there does seem to be this tendency for us over a long period of time to have lived in groups of about the size. Now, if you combine that with the fact that we have about 5 or 6 close social contacts on average between friends and family members, and you think about how many friends of friends of friends you have, that's going to be 5 times 5 times 5. That's about 125 people. And so if natural selection was acting on us in some way that would give us advantages for being in synchrony within a group, then there would be some reason for us to act in synchrony after 3 degrees of separation in these groups of natural size. But 4 degrees of separation, that would be a group of 600 people. Those groups didn't exist 100,000 years ago or even 20,000 years ago. And so there wouldn't have been time for natural selection to have acted on groups this size. So this is purely conjecture on our part, right, to attach these 2 ideas. But we do think that there's something to this, to the fact that we have evolved to influence and be influenced by other people at a distance of no more than 3 degrees of separation. Now, how would you go about testing a crazy idea like this? Well, one of the things that we do is we actually look at the genetics of social networks. So this is something we talk about in the book as well. We conducted a twin study where we compared identical twins to fraternal twins. And this is a very old method for trying to figure out how much of the variance in a person's characteristics can be attributed to variance in the genes. When we do this, what we find is that in degree, the number of people who name you as a friend is about half heritable. So about half the variation can be attributed to genes. Centrality, this measure of where you are in the network, so how close you are to the center of those maps I was showing you a while ago, that also can be attributed to genes, about 1/3 of the variation. But more remarkably, this property called transitivity that I've been talking about is also heritable, right? So the probability that 2 of your friends are friends with one another, for some people that's going to be very high because they live in embedded, densely connected groups. For some people that's going to be low. They want to keep their friends at arm's length distance, like George Costanza. He doesn't want his friends over here becoming friends with his friends over here, his worlds collide theory. Right, so he's someone that really resists having transitive relationships. Well, as it turns out, some of that might be written in your DNA. Right? And what this means is that your genes are having an impact not just on you, but on whether or not 2 other people are friends with one another. And so we've started really to explore the influence of genes on not just individuals, but on whole groups of people and the structures that we form as human beings. So how do we take these natural networks online? So everyone starts out asking me, is your book about Facebook? It's not about Facebook, but we do acknowledge the fact that we live in this new world where social networks are becoming increasingly important online. We've really become hyper-connected. And well, let's think about this, first of all, by thinking about what the cartoonists got wrong from the obesity study. Okay, so first of all, is Homer Simpson going to make you fat? No, Homer Simpson is not going to make you fat, because what the evidence suggests is that in these behavior studies, to change someone's behavior, to be influenced by someone else's behavior, you need a deep, close social contact. Right? So you might think Homer is your best friend, but I'm guessing that's pathological behavior. Right? That really what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about how things spread from person to person through a very small number of people that you're closely connected to. And so maybe all these new connections we get online are not going to be relevant. Here's another one that got it wrong. And this is the one that was the most frustrating, is this message that what our study must mean is that you have to dump your fat friends. We went back to our data and we looked to see all the people who had a friend who had become obese, and we separated them into two groups. The group that got rid of their friend, the dumpers, and the group that kept their friend, these people who were loyal. Which group do you think had the higher risk of obesity in the next period? It was the dumpers. The dumpers had the higher risk of obesity. And the reason why is that although negative things can spread in networks, when your friend starts doing something that's not good for them, it can spread to you. Every friend makes you healthier. Because of the social support benefits of being connected to other people, you get more of a benefit from staying connected than you get from disconnecting from someone who's going to give you bad behavior. And so as a consequence, the cartoon that gets it right makes the right inference from that piece of information. And that's Kathy, of all cartoons. So Kathy, they're a little bit nervous about the study, and they're saying, well, okay, we're not going to buy into that. We're going to stay friends. Well, how do we react to this? Well, we're going to order for each other. And they each point to the other and says, she'll have a dry salad and a water. And so it's this idea that if you want to make a positive change, you don't change the structure of your network so much as you get your friends and family along. If there's one thing I'd like people to get out of this book, it's that you can't do it alone. And we know this even more now than we ever did, because the effect sizes are so strong for how we're connected to other people and what kind of influence they're going to have on us, that we see that these effects not just extend from one person to another, but they reverberate throughout the whole social network. And so Brian Uzi has done some nice work on how you would actually change the structure of networks to be able to achieve outcomes. And this isn't about getting rid of people who don't do a good job, but this is just about how you organize ties to people. And so just for example, what he was able to show is that people who create these networks in order to be able to do something like produce a Broadway musical, whenever they have a hit, there's this instinct for you to just take the same group of people and put them in the room together and say, okay, guys, do it again. Well, as it turns out, when you do that, they don't do so well. And so sequels are almost never good than the original movie, as good as the original movie, right? Well, at the same time, if you just get a bunch of random strangers together in the room, they don't do well either. And so what he really shows with his research is that there's this sweet spot, this Goldilocks point, where what you want is you want a set of relationships where people have worked with one another before, they've developed trust, they've developed these overlapping connections with one another from having worked with one another on individual projects. And so you're able to benefit from the increase in trust that you get from those kinds of overlapping ties. But you want enough new people that connect you to other people's networks that you're going to be able to get new information and new ideas into the project. And he shows this not just for Broadway musicals, but also for academic collaboration. And so you might really be in sync with someone, like Nicholas and I feel like we're kind of on a roll, but you want to continue to work with other people in order to be able to have new sources of information and new ideas flowing into your collaboration. And so how do we sort of deal with this online? Well, let's take, for example, a standard network of people in the real world. So this is 105 close friends in a dorm in an unnamed elite private Northeastern university. And each one of these ties represents a real friendship network. We asked who are your friends, and they told us who their friends were. And you can layer on this different kinds of real-world relationships. So, for example, you might have co-membership in ethnic clubs. You might have roommates, for example, which aren't necessarily going to be the same people who are friends, right? So, I certainly was friends with some of my roommates, and very much not with others. But when you look at this new world that we live in now, this is it. This is Facebook. The average number of people that we claim are our friends in our close context is 5 or 6. The average number of friends in Facebook is 110. So how do we deal with what's going on online? We have to find the real friends on Facebook. And the way that we propose to do that, this is a very simple way, is the very first thing we've done is we've just identified people who are uploading pictures of one another. These picture friends. And so if you upload a picture and you tag that person, then at the very least, you're in the same place at the same time. Right? And when we limit that, we suddenly get an average number that collapses down from 110 to about 5 or 6. And there we start to see, yes, we find relationships between people's behavior on Facebook. And so, for example, this is the picture friend network in Facebook for the same group of people. And the yellows are people who smile in their profile pictures, and the blues are people who don't smile in their profile pictures. And these clusters, they extend out to 3 degrees of separation. We've done this now. We've also coded the weight status of people in their profile pictures. And so just for example, what we find is clusters of overweight women and clusters of overweight men that tend to be connected to each other via these picture relations. Now there's lots of reasons to think that this isn't as good as getting into a doctor's office and getting in your scale, but we did all kinds of reliability checks, and we're in the process of making sure that this is the kind of information that you can actually use to make some inferences about causal processes that might be going on online, in Facebook and other places like that. And so let me skip through this because I want to have time to discuss things. But we've looked at also the spread of music tastes on Facebook, for example, and we find that there are several different kinds of musical tastes that spread. So the Beatles and the Killers, we find evidence that those spread from person to person throughout the network. We also find evidence that different tastes in movies spread throughout the network. And so one very interesting difference that we find with movie tastes is that movie tastes tend to spread in different parts of the network depending on the kind of movie. And so Pulp Fiction fans, for example, they tend to live at the center of the network, whereas Love Actually fans, they tend to live in the periphery. And so this is very important from a marketing perspective, right? If you think that all you have to do is figure out who patient zero is, I'm going to go infect patient zero, and then everyone's going to love my movie, right? I'm going to go get that one person in the center of the network to like Love Actually, and then I'll make $100 million. Well, if you did that here, you would fail, because it turns out that guy doesn't like Love Actually, right? So the network doesn't just influence what spreads across these ties; it also influences your tastes. And it's related to your taste. People with different kinds of tastes will gravitate towards different parts of the network. And so it's important to know how the network interacts with what's flowing on it in order to be able to make these kinds of assessments online in this new world that we're living in Facebook and in these other social media. So let me just conclude by talking about how people have reacted to these studies and really show how deeply connected we are to other people and their behavior. So this is an example of how people react. This person likely thinks that the scientists are telling him these are the things that help to explain why you are the way you are. And here we are telling you that if your friend becomes obese, it increases the likelihood that you'll be obese by 57%. Right? And you hear a number like that and you're thinking, oh my God, what role is there for individual agency? There are all these hundreds of people out there, some of them I don't even know, that are doing things right now that are eventually going to find their way to me and have an impact on my life. So what room is there left for free will? Well, in the book we conclude by turning this on its head. Because while we are influenced by dozens, in some cases hundreds of other people, through these social networks, through these friends of friends of friends, we too have the capacity to influence these people. And this has actually had an impact on my own life. Immediately after publishing the obesity study, I lost 5 pounds and I kept it off. And I did it because I realized that my improved health behavior wouldn't just affect me, it would have an impact on my son, and potentially my son's best friend, and potentially my son's best friend's mother. That all of these people that I care about, and the people that they care about, and the people that they care about are going to be made better by my individual actions. After the happiness paper, I tried very hard when I came home at the end of the day to listen to my favorite song and put myself in a better mood for the very same reason. That there's little things that I can actually do that have an effect on my own individual choices could ripple through the network and make everything better. I think that when you tell someone you don't influence anybody, then they're not likely to work hard to change the world. But if you tell them that they influence 1,000 people, then they're going to take much more seriously their own behavior. And through abandoning this Robinson Crusoe model of social science and this Robinson Crusoe model of the world, I think that we're better able to motivate people to make the kinds of changes that will help them to make positive impacts in their life. And for this reason, I really think that now more than ever, now that we're moving on to these online social networks, and now that we're really trying to figure out how do we use these networks to make the world a better place, it's even more important than ever to understand how and why we are connected. Thank you very much.
We have some time left for some questions. David.
You emphasize in your talk about the dynamics, about the contagion going through a network. In what ways do you think that in the same way these networks just emphasize stasis, and that they re-emphasize existing behaviors, existing political attitudes, just on the radio the other day, James Fowler was just commenting on the state of the healthcare debate. And the interesting thing he said is like, well, the one thing that I've noticed in looking at this is that if you look at the Medicare debate in the early 60s, the Clinton healthcare debate, and the ongoing health debate now, the lines of debate between, no, this is a big government, we can't do it, versus we have a broken system have been exactly the same throughout this entire period when we've had a vastly changing medical sector. And he just commented that it was seen very pressing. And I'm just wondering how much of it is that the way that we sort ourselves can also affect stability in particular activities.
Right, so here's a pictorial answer to your question. This is the blogosphere, political blogosphere. It's a beautiful picture made by Lada Damick at Michigan. And the nodes here represent blogs, and the colors represent whether or not they're liberal or conservative blogs. And this picture is a direct refutation of the idea that the internet was going to democratize discourse, that the internet was going to cause us to be more exposed to a wider variety of points of view. In fact, it seems to be working just the opposite, that because there are just as many, there are so many people out there on the internet, you can find your own unique brand of crazy, right? And you can find exactly the person that lines up exactly with your opinions. And why would you go anywhere else? Why wouldn't you talk to someone who has exactly the same idea as you? So there's very limited discourse. And one of the dangers that we think we need to be aware of with this online world is that it's much easier to fulfill this tendency for homophily online, where we're really going to seek out people who are just like us, rather than seeking out people with diverse points of view to help us to talk to one another and figure out what the best solution to a given problem is. And so, I always sort of end the talk on this uplifting note, but I want to point out, bad things spread in networks, and the networks can create these bad things as well. It creates this, and also creates this rich gets richer kind of paradigm, where now that we have all these online social networks, I think it's going to be even harder for the disenfranchised to be connected and to experience the benefits of being connected, because the more connected you are, the more connected other people are going to want to be to you. And so we talk a lot in the book about how positional inequality is something that we really need to be more concerned with now, making sure that everyone has access to the network. The people who are experiencing great loneliness, they tend to cut off their ties to other people, and that spreads from person to person. And so it gives you this image of, it's not just the case that a yarn is coming loose at the end of the crocheted sweater, but that if you pull on that yarn, the whole thing is going to come unraveled, right? And so now more than ever, I think that the fact that you get these reinforcing tendencies in network, it makes it even more critical for us to figure out how do we reach the people at the edges of the network.
Dimitri, could you speak to the generalizability of Framingham, the city? And the reason I asked was because of the small influence of neighbors. I was wondering if there was something about that city versus other cities, or if this is still a generalizable property about neighborhoods.
Right. Yeah. So when I do the talk just on Framingham, I have a slide that gives characteristics. This is a city that started out as kind of a village, a farming kind of community in 1948. But since then, they've built the interstate, and it's become a bedroom community, so that when you look at people now, they tend to be more affluent than average, they tend to be better educated than average, and they're all white. And so it's not ideal for generalizing to other populations. We don't know why things wouldn't spread in other networks, but maybe the strengths of the way they spread are going to be different. Say in a diverse population, maybe you wouldn't get things spreading as much as in other places. And in terms of the neighbor relations, some people have moved away from Framingham, and so you still have you're still able to look at people who are neighbors when they move to other places. Right? So because they're in the study, they were originally part of this more affluent than average, largely white network, but they may have moved somewhere else, and someone else may have moved nearby, where we have information about both of them to see whether or not neighbors are influencing each other more. But the vast majority of those are going to be in Framingham. And so you can imagine, if Framingham is like what we envisioned in 1948, then this is a world where the neighbors probably have real relationships with one another. If this is like the bedroom community style thing that we're envisioning now, in 2009, then maybe this is one of those neighborhoods like I lived in, which I hated, which was everyone drives in and the garage door comes up, they drive in and it comes down, and no one talks to each other. Right, so I think that framing is actually some mix of those two things. But the issue of generalizability is very important, because I think that what we really want is we want there to be other network studies that have this kind of rich data so that we can see whether or not these are things that are just unique to this one population.
How does geography play into this? Because obviously there are certain geographic pockets where obesity is more of an issue than others. So is it as intense of a relationship between people in those pockets versus people in, say, a large city where it's less of an issue?
Yeah, so we didn't find an interaction effect with distance. I'll just show you really quickly a map of where these people live to give you just to fix ideas. And so within Massachusetts, we've got Framingham's the blue dot here, and then there's the density plot, so the lighter the color. But you can see that people have moved away. And so you have quite a few people who say moved to the Cape, which is not surprising. These are probably retirees, right? But we also have people who spread out across the whole United States. And so we have over 100 participants, for example, here in California and in Florida, because these are the children, right? And so the adults, some of the adults would have moved. They wouldn't have been as mobile then as we are now. But even more so, the children have really spread out. And in some sense, we're kind of lucky that they maintain these ties with the original community, because a full 50% of the friends that were named were also members of the study. So if we just did a random study of the United States and we asked everyone to name their friends, the chances of us having a fully connected network would be very low. So the main thing that we find about distance here is that for the behaviors, distance doesn't interact with the influence effect. And so the friends who live hundreds of miles away appear to have just as much impact as the friends who live next door. For emotions, that's not true. For emotions, we find a very steep fall off. So you need to live within 5 or 10 miles of your friend or your family member in order for their emotional state to have an influence on your emotional state. But other than that, we haven't really explored other ways that distance plays a role in the relationship.
You mentioned, or let's say in your study, the appearance and disappearance of links was playing an important role. Can you comment a little more on the precise methodology, how many neighbors were nominated and so forth? Because it would seem that the appearance or disappearance just because I declared orders 1 and 2 differently.
Yeah, so this is a degree distribution. So
so what was the question that they were asked? Name your closest friends, name
a close friends.
A close friend.
They
could only name one.
Many chose to name more than one. Okay, so it's a very informal instrument, right? They also were asked to name a relative, and we were able to check to see whether or not they had a genetic relationship with this person, right? And so we included the non-related relatives in the friendship category. And so as a consequence, what you end up with is if you add up the friends and spouses, most of them are going to have just one, right? And so it's not going to be a full census. The disadvantage of this is that some of the people that we observe and we think are 3 degrees of separation apart from one another, there might be missing ties where they're actually closer than that to one another via some other connection. On the other hand, by limiting it to just these people, we're just getting the closest, strongest ties. You're naming like the one person that they asked you to name on the study, and they kind of knew what the purpose was, which was to stay in touch with you. So this is someone that you ought to have a good relationship with. And so you may have like a backdoor relationship with somebody else, but it's going to be via a set of channels that are not as strong as the ones that are measured here.
What I was more worried about is that you sort of were investigating whether homophily might be an explanation of the correlation that you observed.
Right.
And if I upgraded someone from my third best friend to my best friend from one year to the next, it will look to you as though
the relationship has disappeared.
It's a new relationship, right? That just appeared.
That's right.
And vice versa if I downgrade.
That's right.
So was there any way to control for this, or do you take this into account?
Yeah. So you can't control for things you don't observe, right? So we control for this, and we do Monte Carlo simulations on the fully observed network to see whether or not the econometric method controls for direct homophily, and it does a very good job of controlling for that. If it's the case that you have people who aren't observed, so these are going to be people who you didn't name as a friend and then later named as a friend. And so the analog here is that for that set of people, you're going to have a relationship that is getting stronger on average relative to the set of people who named each other in one period and in the next. And so I think it's that variation actually, because you're including information about the status now and the status of the previous period, it's that variation that actually ends up being measured. And so I don't think that actually will matter either. The place where we have to worry is indirect homophily, right? So it's not the question of whether or not you and I became friends with one another because of our weight status. but because of something else that's related to our weight status. And so say you and I met each other because we went to the gym, right? Well, we're in the process of doing something that's going to change our weight status. Now, if that has no effect on our weight status, I'm not worried about it because it's going to have no effect on the dependent variable. If it's perfectly correlated with our weight status, I'm not worried about it because I'm controlling for that by controlling for weight status. It's these intermediate ranges, and everything in social science lives in the intermediate range, right? Where you can imagine a process where you're going to influence the weight status in a way that's not directly controlled for by looking at the other proxy. And so we just had a big conference at Harvard actually a couple weeks ago with a bunch of economists and physicists and sociologists and health professionals trying to think about what's the next stage of network models that would help us to address issues like this particular issue. And so this is very much a work in progress in terms of trying to think about what the best methods are for doing this kind of analysis.
Okay.
Yeah, one quick question. So now you look at a network of different size, in your study, and are there some phenomena that is just true only in a very large scale network and fail to be true in sort of medium-sized network?
Okay, so far on Facebook, we have not found evidence of any associations with the things we looked at among Facebook friends. There's just too many of them, right? So it's the problem is that the 110 friends is almost like no different from choosing someone randomly in the population. And I don't know what your guys' experience is on Facebook, but I actually am friends with some people that I don't even know. Right, so there are some people that will do that. Some people will keep a tighter circle and they'll refuse friendships from other people. But I think the average norm is you feel bad about not accepting a friendship nomination. And so the problem is that those extra people that then you're sort of in touch with are people that are almost no different than strangers. And so I'm not aware of a study that shows that you get large-scale things happening through these weak ties that don't happen through the strong ties. But I can imagine the spread of information would be a good candidate for this, right? So just for example, there was a thing on Facebook, 25 things about me. Did you guys sort of see this where everyone was supposed to post a list of 25 things? And it spread. I'd love to have data on that to see how it spread from person to person because it's a real example of word of mouth. I'm sure that spread between strangers, right? And so why that spread between strangers and not some of these other things is an open question. But my guess is that it's going to be exchange of information is going to be, which is pure information. Those are the kinds of things that you would see spreading in larger networks and not necessarily between close friends.
Okay, Benjamin, we'll give you the last question.
You mentioned, you showed several different cartoons of people responding to an awareness of your results. And you also talked about how you in your own life were changing some of your behavior. I wonder about, you did also mention that there's a direction not to go, which is to start cutting off friends that are bad. But the other direction seems possible to start adding friends in the direction you might want to move. This is it's a specific example, but the more general question is, as people are starting to respond and become more aware of these kind of network phenomenon, are you hearing about professionals who are doing kind of career counseling differently, or relationship counseling, or weight loss programs? And how is this kind of tying back to the feedback loops in society?
Right. So one thing is that one of the goals of social science, I think, is to take our intuitions and show that they're true, right? And so Alcoholics Anonymous and Weight Watchers are both very successful programs that have known for a long time that you can't do it alone, right? And that your friendship networks are extremely powerful, and if you don't get some new friends fast, that you're going to fall into the same old patterns, right? And so I think that you have some of these older groups that are saying, or just rationalizing what they've been doing all along, but using a different language to talk about what they've been doing. But you also, I've been getting a lot of requests from people in marketing, for example, to give them advice on what to do differently, right? And so people from Nike, people from PR firms, people from Blue Cross Blue Shield, they want to know, well, okay, so given all this information, how do I design interventions differently in order to achieve a good outcome? That's very much an open question, right? So for me, as a social scientist, I've been interested in what is rather than what could be. But we're more interested in this question now. And so, for example, we have an H1N1 study at Harvard right now where we've hypothesized that a good way to monitor the spread of the outbreak of a disease is by looking at the more central people rather than the peripheral people. And the theory is that the people at the center of the network are going to get H1N1 first because they have shorter, they're connected by a smaller number of steps to other people who randomly get it in a network. And if that's true, you can imagine on a large scale, the advice is, don't follow people randomly in the network, but get people to nominate a friend and follow those people. In fact, there was a simulation study that was published in response to our study that suggests that if you were short on vaccine and you only had a third of the vaccine that you needed to get population coverage, what you should do instead of vaccinating people at random from the population, you should get them to name a friend and vaccinate the friends instead. Because the friends, on average, are going to be much more central. So someone who's nominated as a friend, if you're nominated through that process, if you have 10 friends, you're 10 times more likely to be nominated than if you only have one friend. And so even if you don't have these pictures of like the whole network, there are little things I think that we're going to become aware of being able to apply as a basis of understanding these spreading processes that may help not just for things that are literal contagions like the spread of flu, but also these behavioral contagions like the things that we've been talking about now.
Our speaker next January 11th is David Sussman. He's from the Department of History at the University of Delaware. I don't have the title of his talk right now, but this particular session will be sponsored by Josh Kuhn and the Norman Lear Center. So the Annenberg Research Seminar wishes you all very happy holidays. Look forward to seeing you next semester, and join me in thanking James for a very